It was a sunny Sunday, the 26th of July, 1914, a day that started with a great sense of purpose for the Irish volunteers. Down at the harbour in Howth, just north of Dublin City, a yacht sailed into view, its journey a secret kept by a dedicated few. On board were Erskine Childers, his wife Molly, and a precious cargo that would change the course of Irish history. They weren't carrying holiday trinkets or fishing gear, but a consignment of 900 Mauser rifles and thousands of rounds of ammunition, bought in Germany. This was the famous Howth gun running, a daring plan to arm a nationalist force that was growing by the day, a force determined to see Home Rule for Ireland become a reality. The Irish Volunteers had been formed only the year before, in 1913, as a direct response to events up in Ulster. They saw the Ulster Volunteer Force arming themselves to resist Home Rule, and they reckoned rightly that what was good for the goose was good for the gander. If the Unionists could bring in guns to defy the British government's will, then nationalists could do the same to defend it. The Volunteers were a broad church, attracting men from all walks of life, from academics like Ian MacNeill to poets like Padraig Pearse, all united by a desire to secure Ireland's right to self-government. The landing of the guns at Howth was a massive statement of intent, a public declaration that they were a force to be taken seriously. As they docked, hundreds of volunteers were waiting on the pier, ready to unload the precious cargo. The whole operation was carried out with a sort of disciplined excitement, the men forming lines to pass the rifles from the yacht onto the shore. It was a hugely symbolic moment, broadcast for all to see. Unlike the Unionists' Larne gun running, which had been a much larger, clandestine operation, carried out with a nod and a wink from the authorities, the Howth Landing was a deliberate act of public defiance. The volunteers weren't hiding what they were doing. They were marching their new weapons back towards Dublin in broad daylight for the whole world to see. This open challenge didn't go unnoticed by the Crown forces, who were in a right state over the whole affair. The Dublin Metropolitan Police and British soldiers were quickly scrambled to intercept the marching volunteers. The authorities, who had turned a blind eye to the tens of thousands of rifles landed by the UVF in Ulster just a few months earlier, were now determined to stop the nationalists from having any weapons at all. This glaring double standard wasn't lost on the people of Dublin. As the volunteers marched back towards the city, a sense of confrontation was building, and the stage was set for a clash that would have bloody and far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this. The Irish Volunteers, marching back from Howth with their newly acquired rifles, were a citizen army, a collection of ordinary men who had answered a call to defend the promise of Irish self-governance. They were teachers, clerks, and labourers, men who believed that the impending Home Rule Act, passed by the British Parliament, needed a body of armed Irishmen to guarantee its implementation. Their leader on the day, Bulmer Hobson, had organized the landing with great care. Their actions were a direct consequence of the political climate, where it seemed that armed force was the only language the British establishment truly understood, especially after the Unionists had armed themselves to the teeth without any real consequence. In stark contrast were the soldiers of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. They were a professional regiment of the British Army, stationed in Dublin to maintain order for the Crown. They were instruments of the state, trained to follow commands without question. When they were ordered to confront the volunteers and seize the weapons, that was their duty. However, their intervention highlighted a massive hypocrisy in British policy. The Unionists in Ulster had landed nearly 25,000 rifles in April at Larne, a far greater arsenal, and the authorities had done absolutely nothing to stop them. Now, faced with a much smaller nationalist gun running, the full force of the state was being brought to bear, and it made the government look hopelessly biased. As the volunteers made their way back towards the city, they were met by a large force of police and soldiers near Clontarf. A tense standoff followed. The Assistant Commissioner of the Dublin Metropolitan Police demanded the surrender of the rifles, but the volunteers refused. After a bit of a scuffle and some clever maneuvering by the volunteers, many of them managed to slip away through the side roads, taking their precious rifles with them. The main body, however, continued their march, though many had now cleverly disassembled their guns or handed them off to sympathetic members of the public who had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. The frustrated soldiers, having failed to seize the bulk of the weapons, began their march back to their barracks in the city center. They were not in a good humor. They felt they had been made fools of, outsmarted by a crowd of civilians. As they marched along the north quays of the River Liffey, they attracted a growing crowd of Dubliners. The mood was turning sour. The people on the streets, already aware of the double standards at play, began to jeer and taunt the soldiers. They saw them not as peacekeepers, but as bullies enforcing an unjust law against their own countrymen while letting the Unionists away with murder. The route back to the Royal Barracks took the King's Own Scottish borderers right through the heart of Dublin, along the northern quays. By the time they reached Bachelor's Walk, a long straight stretch of road beside the Liffey, the atmosphere had become electric with hostility. A large and angry crowd had gathered, their numbers swelling with every step the soldiers took. These weren't the volunteers who had mostly dispersed by now, but ordinary Dubliners, men, women, and children who were incensed by what they had witnessed. They saw the soldiers as an occupying force that had tried and failed to disarm Irishmen who were only doing what Ulster Unionists had already done on a much grander scale. The crowd's anger boiled over into open provocation. They hurled insults and taunts at the marching soldiers, calling them bullies and cowards. The soldiers, already frustrated and humiliated by their failure to seize the guns at Clontarf, were becoming increasingly agitated. Their officers were struggling to maintain control of their men. The discipline that holds a professional army together began to fray under the constant barrage of abuse from the Dublin citizens lining the street. The situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The soldiers were marching with fixed bayonets, a menacing sight that only served to further inflame the passions of the crowd. At one point along Bachelor's Walk, the confrontation reached its peak. A small number of soldiers, goaded beyond endurance, turned on the crowd. There were scuffles, and some soldiers lunged at civilians with the butts of their rifles and their bayonets. This aggression from the troops only made the crowd even more furious, and the scene descended into chaos, a messy, violent confrontation between armed soldiers and an unarmed civilian population. It was in this moment of pure chaos that the fatal decision was made. Major Alexander Haig, the officer in command, later claimed he gave no such order, but somewhere in the confusion, a number of soldiers from the rear of the column stopped, turned, and raised their rifles. They took aim not at an opposing army, but at the mass of ordinary Dubliners on the pavement. Without a formal order to fire being clearly heard, they let loose a volley of shots directly into the crowd. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across the Liffey, and suddenly, the jeers and shouts of the crowd were replaced by screams of pain and terror. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was one of horror and disbelief. On the cobblestones of Bachelor's Walk lay the dead and dying. 3 people were killed outright: Mary Duffy, a 50-year-old woman, James Brennan, and Patrick Quinn. Another man, Francis Hobbs, would die from his bayonet wounds a few days later. In total, nearly 40 people were injured, caught in the volley of bullets fired by the soldiers. Among the wounded was a man named Luke Kelly, a Dublin laborer, whose son, the famous folk singer of the same name, would be born years later. The victims were not armed rebels. They were ordinary citizens, and their only crime was to be on a Dublin street, protesting what they saw as a grave injustice. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the British authorities and for the constitutional nationalist leader, John Redmond. The Massacre, as it was instantly named, exposed the raw hypocrisy of British rule in Ireland. The army had shot down unarmed nationalists in Dublin for doing far less than the armed Unionists in Ulster, who had faced no sanction at all. The public mood, which had been broadly supportive of Home Rule and constitutional methods, swung dramatically towards a more radical, separatist position. How could anyone trust a British government whose army would gun down its own citizens on the streets of the capital? The event galvanized nationalist opinion like nothing before. It provided the more militant wing of the volunteers with all the proof they needed that Britain would only respond to physical force. Padraig Pearse, a man who was already on a revolutionary path, captured the new mood perfectly. In a fiery graveside oration for the victims, he declared, "The volunteers have been baptized in the blood of their fellow citizens." He went on to make a chillingly prophetic statement. "The Army of Ireland has been consecrated by the blood of the martyrs of Bachelor's Walk, and the Orange man who boasts his loyalty, the Unionist who is pro-English, will henceforth be not merely a traitor to his country, but a traitor to the dead." The Bachelor's Walk massacre was, without question, a pivotal turning point. It destroyed the credibility of John Redmond's Irish Parliamentary Party and the path of constitutional nationalism. It fueled the rise of the revolutionary movement, convincing many that peaceful negotiation was a fool's game. The bloodshed on that summer's day in 1914 watered the seeds of the 1916 Easter Rising. It created a generation of martyrs and hardened hearts across the island, pushing Ireland ever closer to a war for its independence. The shots fired on Bachelor's Walk echoed far beyond the Dublin Quays. They were the opening shots of a new and violent chapter in Ireland's long struggle for freedom.